Hello, welcome to the People of 1381. I'm Adrian Bell and introduce my colleague.
Hi, I'm Helen Lacey. I'm a lecturer at Mansfield College, University of Oxford.
So today we're talking about a few aspects of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. And I was going to ask you, Helen, how does the revolt live on in the centuries after 1381?
Yeah, I think we see a long cultural sort of afterlife of the revolt. You could say probably most clearly in the revolts after 1381, there might be this connection to the the patterns of revolt that 1381 had sort of shown us. So, for instance, you could go to 1450 when you have Cade's revolt. A lot of similarities with what happens in Cade's revolt as well. It happens in late spring, like 1381 does. It follows a military humiliation in France. The rebels assemble on Blackheath, like the rebels in 1381 do. They kill the treasurer. And they make complaints about the corruption of royal ministers, extortionate taxation, as well as things like forest laws and statute of labourers still, which are all things that come up in 1381. The differences are there as well. By 1450, it's interesting that the rebels present their grievances in a coherent written programme. So that might tell us something about the different levels of literacy. But then even when you go on into the Tudor rebellions and even, you could even say into the 19th century sort of protests and risings, they do cite the name of Wat Tyler and evoke this sense of the image of 1381, and the rebels and the peasant rebels that they kind of conjure up. There's also an afterlife in terms of the decline of villeinage. So obviously, one of the things in 1381 is that they claim they want to eradicate villeinage and have everyone be free and not servile to lords. And eventually that does happen and it disappears. By the early 16th century, there really isn't any meaningful villeinage anymore. That's really because of the long-term economic effect that landlords want to move towards cash rents. But you could say that that's sort of something that's worked out after the revolt, and that's the sort of line in the sand that's drawn about villeinage. Then in other terms, in sort of cultural terms, you can say that writers talked a lot about the revolt in even the centuries after 1381. So immediately following the Rising, you've got protest literature. So the end of Richard II's reign, there's a lot of poetry and protest literature written about some of the things that the rebels were protesting about in 1381. And also Chaucer writes about it in 2 lines of Chaucer's work. He writes about Jack Straw and his men shouting throughout London and killing Flemings. It's interesting that he goes in for the point that they killed Flemings. And another writer of the age, John Gower, writes a long piece about the Peasants' Revolt in his work called Vox Clamantis. He's written the book and then he adds a new first section to it, which describes in great detail and very kind of not glowing, but really condemnatory terms, the rebels, and he talks about them as monsters coming out of the woods and the marshes to attack London. So that's one of the most famous writers of the age, John Gower. Then when you move to the 16th century, they're still talking about the revolt, and the Tudors are invoking the revolt still as a model for what happens when you have bad rule and when the lower classes don't accept their station in life. So, this is the ultimate warning to society, what could happen if people don't accept their station, as it were, for the Tudors. And you have a play called The Life and Death of Jack Straw being written in the late 16th century with that sort of warning. Shakespeare doesn't refer to it, interestingly, but I can imagine Shakespeare would sort of make the same points. And then you move through into sort of the French Revolutionary period. They're still talking about the revolt there. And you have writers of the age like Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine writing about the revolt. Burke sort of argues against the revolt. And then Thomas Paine comes back in his Rights of Man and talks about the sort of the revolutionary leader that was Wat Tyler and how this forms the foundation of the English radical tradition. And even the Chartists have a brigade called the Wat Tyler Brigade. So they're still conjuring with the name of Wat Tyler and the evocation of 1381. And you got Robert Southey writes a poem called Wat Tyler in 1817. So, he's alongside Byron and Shelley in those kind of writers who are talking in revolutionary tones and evoking 1381. Then you could go through even to, someone like Engels, Marx and Engels, writing about Marxist theories of history and the economic base that drives history, they argue. And Engels writes about the German Peasant War, but his theories then feed into the Marxist model of the economic foundation of and movement of history in terms of historical causation through economic models. So the Peasants' Revolt is there as the end of feudalism and then the movement to capitalism in terms of class war, as they would call it. And that's not entirely gone from the scholarship, although most modern scholars would caveat sort of Marxist views now. And again, in the 19th century, William Morris writes The Dream of John Ball, and he is evoking these kind of, it's almost sentimental, egalitarian, socialist ideas of the Middle Ages. And for him in particular, John Ball is this radical visionary that we should be harking back to, or they in the Victorian society should hark back to the idea of John Ball and when Adam delved and Eve Spann, who was then the gentleman. And how does all this differ from our approach? I think that for us, what we're doing with the project and the database is to take a really fine-grained approach and think about the individuals who took part and what their individual motives was. So, this is going to be complex and varied, and we're not going to have this broad brushstrokes kind of theory of the past centuries that I've been talking about, but instead we're going to say that people join the revolts for all kinds of different reasons, and here are some of the causes and how they differ region by region or even manor by manor. If you look at the peasant level of the agricultural labourers. So I think that's how we're differing from these sort of broad brushstrokes of what's been said in the past.
I thought it was fascinating, and there's another for people who are interested. There's one of our People and Places is a John Ball in History and Memory, written by a friend of the project, James Crossley, which similarly looks at John Ball over time. And I think people could also think about their own experience or cultural experience of the revolt. What have they heard? Have they heard of Wat Tyler? Lots of schools, aren't they? And we know primary schools, there's a famously named Wat Tyler Primary School. What does that mean in popular song? We know that there's a number of songs and out there as well. So I think it's something that we found very fascinating. So thank you very much, Helen.
Thanks.